Most people think of the time of Julius Caesar as a political drama. Legions, wars, and conquests. Epic power struggles in a distant, forgotten past. But for the people actually living in Rome, daily life was not defined by conquest. It was defined by money, or more precisely, by the lack of it. The world where the historical figure of Julius Caesar rose was shaped by one of the most predatory economic systems the Roman Republic had ever produced. By the mid-1st century BCE, Rome sat at the core of a sprawling empire, the most efficient extraction machine the world had ever seen. Rome didn't care about building up its provinces. It only cared about what they could send back to the heart of the empire. Conquest existed to move wealth inward. Silver from Hispania, Sicilian grain, slaves from Asia, Germania, and Persia, flowing from the edges of the Republic toward Rome itself. This inflow was the root of the crisis. This mattered because Rome was not uniformly wealthy. It was deeply divided, unstable, and fragile. A vast population of small farmers, the legion's backbone, lived off the land. Not estates, but plots just large enough to survive. Instead of creating wealth, years of war only led to ruin. The Senate, more often than not, simply did not care. Rome governed through a senatorial aristocracy whose wealth was built on conquered land and slaves. Men like Crassus and Pompey operated with political impunity. Their goal was not to sustain the citizenry, but to build personal power and ensure revenue kept flowing. Debt was the system's engine. And this is where things get really worse. People today think of ancient wealth as land and spoils. In Julius Caesar's Rome, credit was the real power. Money was lent against future prospects, political and personal. You borrowed because you had ambition. Loans for Senate election campaigns, advances against harvests, loans on ancestral farms. Miss a payment, and the consequences were absolute. There were no banks as we know them. There was no regulatory oversight. Money lending was dominated by elite creditors who financed politicians and then squeezed debtors to recover their investments and make a fortune. Exploitation was the business model. If you were a senator, you borrowed to buy votes. If you were a farmer, you borrowed to survive. Debt was everywhere. And unlike modern debt, it knew no filing for bankruptcy. Interest compounded ruthlessly. Land and liberty were the collateral. One missed harvest or lost election could push a family or a politician into a spiral they would never escape. Here's how it usually worked. A farmer serves in the legions for years. While he's gone, his land fails. Taxes are still due. The farmer borrows from a local patron, often a senator amassing estate. Interest accrues. The next season, competition from slave-grown grain crushes prices. Debt remains. Eventually, the land is seized. The farmer moves to Rome, joining the precarious urban plebs. Or worse, he sells himself into debt bondage, or disappears entirely. Over time, land was in fewer hands. Vast slave-worked estates replaced citizen plots. Wealth clustered around a senatorial class living on credit and provincial plunder. The majority sank into landless dependency. The economy didn't just produce inequality, it weaponized it. And there was no state safety net. If you lost your farm, there was no grain dole yet, no veteran pension, no welfare. Patronage was the only buffer. Client networks existed, but they were transactional. Debt wasn't just financial, it was social. Losing land meant losing status, losing security, losing identity. Your family's future could be wiped out by a drought, a tax increase, or a single unpaid obligation. When too many people fell at once, the Republic offered nothing but strife, and the stage was set for a populist strongman to rise. The stage found its man in Julius Caesar. But to understand his meteoric and terminal rise, one must first see the economy not as a mere backdrop to political drama, but as the main character. A voracious, insatiable entity whose resolve demanded the Republic's consumption. By 60 BCE, the Republic's financial machinery was seizing up, groaning under the contradictions of its own success. The system of conquest that had once flooded Italy with wealth and created a sturdy peasant soldier class now generated catastrophic, recursive side effects. The spoils of war, slaves, bullion, land, flowed to the victorious generals and the ruthless private tax-farming nobility that methodically squeezed the provinces dry. This concentrated capital, pooling in Rome, demanding returns. This turned into predatory lending and land speculation, accelerating the dispossession of the very countryside that bred Rome's legions. A feedback loop of ruin was created. Conquest funded by the elite's capital, which was used to displace the citizens, whose displacement then required more conquest to placate them with bread and circuses. A cycle that fed upon itself until the core was rotten. Rome became a hotbed of discontent. The swelling urban population of displaced farmers and freed slaves, politically volatile and dangerously idle, relied on the subsidized grain. This had morphed into the ultimate political weapon, a lever ambitious tribunes pulled at will. Meanwhile, the ruling class was drowning in the very debt cycle it created. Ambitious senators, required to finance lavish games and campaigns from personal wealth, sank into staggering debt. They borrowed from mega-creditors like Crassus, betting their futures on securing a lucrative provincial command, a license to plunder and repay their backers. Thus, the state's fiscal engine became hopelessly entangled with private debt. The senatorial elite were not just disinterested rulers. They were the system's primary creditors, its most desperate debtors, and its captors. The Republic was governed by a Senate personally leveraged to its destruction. Enter Caesar. He was not an outsider railing against a corrupt system. He was its most brilliant, adaptable, and catastrophically indebted product. Early in his career, he bribed Pontifex Maximus, and his extravagant conquests were funded by massive loans, most notably from Marcus Crassus. Crassus himself was the archetype of the new financier, having built his fortune on the grim pillars of the era: real estate speculation in Rome's slums, slave trading from conquered regions like Syria, and fire sale purchases of proscribed citizens' property. Caesar's genius was to recognize that in this debt-saturated polity, the system's ultimate tool, the proconsular army, could be transformed into the ultimate debt relief program and capital acquiring vehicle. His conquest of Gaul was not merely a military campaign. It was the largest plunder at the time. He borrowed further, likely leveraging future expectations, to raise legions with the understanding that Gallic gold, slaves, and plunder would serve as both collateral and repayment. The haul was staggering. Hundreds of millions of sesterces in bullion, perhaps 1 million enslaved people, vast tracts of land. This wealth performed a dual transformative function. First, it allowed Caesar to clear his own astronomical personal debts, freeing him from the creditor clique that held Pompey and others in check. Second, and more crucially, it allowed him to become the creditor. He famously paid off the crushing debts of key supporters like the tribune Marcus Rufus. He bought the unwavering loyalty of his soldiers with massive bonuses and of the urban plebs with monumental public works and feasts. He effectively short-circuited the traditional diffuse patronage networks of the Senate, creating a new, centralized, one funded by direct provincial extraction and answerable only to him. Gaul was a raid that yielded the capital to finance a takeover of the parent company, Rome. Pompey, though militarily mighty, was ultimately the instrument of the entrenched, conservative, senatorial, and equestrian banking interests. These were the publicani tax farmers, the moneylenders, and the great landowners whose wealth was built on a complex, interlocking system of credit, provincial extraction, and political privilege. They feared Caesar not merely as a rival for prestige, but as a terrifyingly autonomous force whose Gallic conquests had created a financial power base completely outside their control. Caesar's wealth was unmediated. It bypassed the senatorial patronage networks and the equestrian tax collection schemes, flowing directly from plunder and tribute into his own coffers, and crucially, into the loyalty of his legions. His march on Rome was, in this stark economic sense, a hostile takeover bid funded by offshore assets, the riches of Gaul, and aimed at seizing the treasury and the mint, the central sources of legal tender and financial legitimacy. Upon victory, his reforms as dictator were a radical mix of massive debt restructuring and economic shock therapy, meticulously designed to break the old parasitic cycle that had strangled the republic. The system had become a self-cannibalizing machine. Conquest brought in new wealth, which was loaned at high interest to finance political careers and lavish consumption, leading to crippling debt, land consolidation, and a desperate, impoverished urban populace. Caesar attacked this crisis on multiple fronts. He passed laws forgiving a significant portion of rents and interest accrued during the Civil War, a direct and calculated assault on creditor power designed to alleviate the social tension that threatened his new regime. This was not mere populism. It was a strategic reset of the financial clock. Simultaneously, he launched the most extensive colonization project in Roman history, aiming to drain the dangerous, dependent urban population of Rome into new towns across the empire. This turned landless citizens and discharged veterans into propertied landowners, creating a vast, stable base of direct loyalty to him, while also stimulating provincial economies. He regulated the harsh terms of debt repayment, reinstating and enforcing laws against the old practice of debt bondage, thus placing a crucial limit on the financial predation that could turn a Roman citizen into a slave. In the end, the political economy of the late Republic did not simply produce Caesar. It demanded him. The state had become a machine where money, born from conquest, demanded ever more conquest to service the debts it created. This debt bound the highest senator, mortgaging his future for electoral success, and the lowest peasant, struggling under impossible rents in a shared, if grotesquely unequal, chain of desperation. The only escape from this suffocating financial trap was to seize the ultimate source of capital and legitimacy, which was Rome itself. Thus, Caesar didn't just cross the Rubicon. He led an army of debtors across it. The legionaries followed him not only out of personal loyalty, but because he alone held the deed to their financial futures. The promised bonuses and land grants. The urban plebs supported him because he was their sole relief from crippling, inescapable debt. The elite opposed him because he threatened to replace their intricate, oligarchic web of financial power with a single sovereign source of economic authority, the dictator. In doing so, he exchanged a dying republic, strangled by its own parasitic capital, for the nascent logic of an imperial economy. In this new system, the ultimate bank was the emperor, the singular font of all patronage, pardon, and liquidity. Caesar's assassination paused, but could not reverse this transformation. The economy, in its scale and crisis, had demanded a monarch to act as ultimate arbiter and guarantor. Augustus would ultimately perfect the system. Caesar's debt and ambition had forced him to invent an empire where all financial roads, all streams of tribute, credit, and reward led back irrevocably and inexorably to the throne. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.